There are parts of the Ozark National Forest that don't see another human being for weeks at a time, maybe longer. The trails thin out, the cell signal disappears, and what's left is just timber and ridge and the kind of dark that doesn't have a bottom to it. People go in there to find themselves, to reset, to get away from whatever they're getting away from. Some of them find something else instead. The accounts in this collection were shared with me over the course of about 2 years. Some of the people asked me to change their names. Some of them just stopped responding after they sent it, like the act of writing it down was enough, and they didn't want to talk about it anymore. I don't blame them for that. Reading these, you'll understand why. What comes next is better experienced in the dark. Listen carefully. Now, put on your headphones. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always find it interesting to know who's out there and when. Story 1. Marcus. The circle was about 8 inches across. I remember that specifically because I measured it later with my hand. 8 inches, give or take. And the teeth inside it were arranged almost perfectly evenly spaced, like someone had taken their time. I want to start there because I think if I start somewhere else, I'll lose the thread. And once I lose the thread on this, I don't pick it back up easy. My name's Marcus. I'm 34. I worked at the time, in HVAC repair out of Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was late October, a couple years back, and I had a week off that I hadn't planned for. My work truck had blown a head gasket, and while it was getting fixed, my boss told me to take the week. I wasn't seeing anyone. My apartment was fine, but it wasn't a place I liked being in when I had nothing to do. I'd done a few backpacking trips before, nothing serious. 3-4 days at a time. The Ozarks were close, and I knew the general area, so I threw my gear together and drove out to a trailhead off Highway 21. I told my buddy Dale where I was going. He said, "Sure, sounds good. Let me know when you're back." That was it. Nobody was expecting to hear from me for a week. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I found a good campsite on the 3rd day near a creek. Soft ground, good tree cover. I'd been pushing hard to get there, and I remember sitting down after I made camp and just exhaling. That specific kind of exhale. The one that means you're okay for a minute. The creek made enough noise to feel company-like without being intrusive. I ate my freeze-dried meal and watched the fire go low, and I slept better than I had in months. I didn't notice anything that night. I want to be clear about that. The first night at that site was completely normal. It was the morning I noticed it. I'd crawled out of my tent around 6:30 to get water from the creek, and I was still half asleep, and I almost stepped on it. Little circle of white things in the dirt just to the left of where my tent door opened. I thought at first it was rocks, small white rocks arranged in a circle. I crouched down. They weren't rocks. I picked one up before I understood what I was looking at. Small, worn, kind of yellowy white. I turned it over in my fingers, and my brain just refused to complete the thought for a second. And then it completed the thought. It was a tooth, a human molar from the look of it. I set it back down, stood up. There were 7 of them in the circle. I counted twice, each one resting flat in the dirt with maybe an inch between them, the whole arrangement fitting inside my 2 hands placed side by side. My first thought, and I am a little embarrassed to admit this, was that some kid had lost a bunch of teeth out here and they just somehow ended up in a circle, like a tooth fairy situation gone weird. I know. But that's the thing your brain does when it's trying to protect you from the other thought. The other thought was, someone put these here while I was sleeping, and I didn't hear anything. I checked my tent. Nothing touched. Nothing moved. My food bag was still hanging from the branch where I'd put it. Everything exactly as I'd left it. The only thing different in the entire campsite was that circle of teeth. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. The creek was doing its thing and the birds were starting up, and it was, by every measure, a fine, cool October morning in the woods. There was nothing to be afraid of on the surface of it. I'd been camping alone a dozen times. I knew what solitude felt like, and this wasn't the bad kind. But I kept coming back to those teeth. I thought about packing up and leaving. I sat with that thought for maybe 10 minutes while I boiled water for coffee. The rational side of me said it was probably some weird prank, probably hikers who'd passed through earlier in the season and left something strange as a joke, and the arrangement might not even be intentional. They might have just scattered and ended up like that somehow. I cycled through every version of a reasonable explanation I could come up with. Then I thought about it differently. For something to have arranged those teeth in a circle around my tent door, it had to have been close enough to my tent to touch. Whatever did that was within arm's reach of where I was sleeping. I didn't leave. I don't know exactly why. Something in me had decided to treat it as a strange discovery rather than a warning, which I understand, in retrospect, was probably not the right call. But I was 34 and alone, and I think I was more afraid of being the kind of person who got scared and ran home than I was of whatever left those teeth. I scattered the circle with my boot, went about my day, hiked south along the creek for a few hours, took some pictures, came back in the afternoon, had dinner, made a fire that was maybe a bit bigger than I usually would. I checked the ground around the tent before I got in. Nothing. I zipped the tent shut. I lay there for a long time, listening to the creek, before I finally fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, there were 11 teeth. Same circle shape, same spacing, but bigger this time, and more of them, and arranged around the same spot. That same worn patch of dirt just outside the tent door, like whatever was leaving them knew exactly where I'd step out. The stories I carry with me now are the ones I keep returning to in the middle of the night, not because I want to, just because they're still there, still waiting. I took photos that second morning. I've looked at them hundreds of times since then. There's nothing in the background, no shadows between the trees, no figure, just the teeth and my boot and a patch of morning light on the forest floor. I packed up that day. I walked out. I didn't run, exactly, but I walked faster than I needed to, and I didn't stop once to take a picture or check my map. I just followed the creek north until I hit the trail, and I had followed the trail back to the road, and I drove to Fort Smith, and I sat in my apartment for 3 days without really doing much. I told Dale about it. He said that was creepy, and then we talked about something else. I brought the photographs to a dentist I know, a guy I went to high school with. He looked at them on my phone and said they looked like real human teeth to him. Molars and premolars mostly, with some wear on them that suggested they'd belong to an adult, not a child. He asked me where I'd gotten them. I told him I'd found them in the woods. He gave me a look that I've thought about a lot since then. Not disbelief exactly, more like he was deciding how much he wanted to know, and then deciding he didn't want to know more than he already did. He handed my phone back and changed the subject. I've been back to the Ozarks a few times since. Different trailheads, different areas, never back to that specific site. I know roughly where it is on the map. I've thought about going back probably 100 times. The thing I keep coming back to is this. The first night, nothing. Clean ground, no disturbance, completely normal campsite. And then morning 1, 7 teeth. Morning 2, 11. Whatever it was already there the first night. It just hadn't introduced itself yet. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything. But that thought, that it was already there, already close, watching me sleep that first night without leaving anything. That's the part I can't put down. Story 2, Diane, as told to her brother. This one was shared with me by a man in Conway, Arkansas. He was relaying it on behalf of his sister, who he said wouldn't talk about it directly anymore. He wrote it down the way she'd told it to him, and I've kept it as close to that as I can. She'd done it before, that's the thing. She'd done solo trips in the Ozarks 3, 4 times, and she knew what she was doing. She wasn't a beginner, she had good gear and she was fit, and she knew how to read a trail and how to make camp, and she wasn't the type to get spooked by the dark. She went out in early September, which is a good time up in those hills, before the hunters come in and after the summer crowd thins. She planned 8 days. She went in through the Richland Creek Wilderness area and she had a route mapped that was going to take her in a big loop and bring her back to her car. She made it 3 days before she realized she was turned around. She said later, she still wasn't sure how it happened. She knew that area. She'd been watching her compass. But on the 3rd day, she came over a ridge, and nothing on the other side matched her map. And by the time she'd worked it out, the light was going, and she had to make camp in a place she didn't recognize. She wasn't panicked yet. She was frustrated and a little annoyed at herself, but not frightened. She had food for another 5 days and her emergency gear, and she figured she'd get her bearings in the morning. She made camp on a flat shelf of ground below the ridge, dug in among some old oaks. Good spot, she said. Felt stable. She ate, she wrote in her journal. She got into her sleeping bag around 9, and she was out by 9:30. In the morning, she found the teeth. 4 of them in a line leading away from her tent. Just a line, not a circle. 4 teeth in a row pointing roughly northeast, evenly spaced, like a trail. She stared at them for a long time. Then she packed up everything very carefully and deliberately, and she started walking northeast. Her brother said she couldn't fully explain that decision. She just said it felt like they were pointing somewhere and she was lost anyway, and going northeast was as good a direction as any. She knew it sounds strange. She knew how it sounds. She walked northeast for about 4 hours. She found the trail. She followed the trail back to her car and she drove home. She never finished the loop she'd planned. What she told her brother, the part he said she kept coming back to. It was the line that bothered her. Not a circle, a line, pointing somewhere specific, like someone had been trying to communicate something with them, like someone had wanted to help. And she said, and this is the part her brother said she said very quietly, she wasn't sure she wanted to know what would have been left if she'd stayed a second night. If you're still listening, you already know this story isn't going to end the way you want it to. Story 3. Tom. I was 51 when this happened, and I've been camping my whole life. I'm not someone who scares easily, and I'm not someone who makes things up or exaggerates for effect. I'm a retired county surveyor. I spent 30 years working in the field, alone, in all kinds of terrain and all kinds of weather. I know the difference between something real and something my head made up. What happened in the Ozarks in the spring of 2 years ago was real. My wife passed away 18 months before the trip. There are parts of the Ozark National Forest years ago was real. My wife passed away 18 months before the trip. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Our kids live out of state, and they were good about coming home when they could. But mostly it was me and her and the hospital. After, I didn't really know what to do with myself. The house was too big and too quiet, and every room had something in it that reminded me of her. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because it matters for the rest of it. A colleague of mine, retired a few years ahead of me, said I should go camping. He said getting out in the field again would help. He was right about that, I think, as a general principle. I picked a section of the Buffalo River Trail I hadn't been to in years, packed for 5 days, and went in on a Thursday morning. The first 2 days were hard in the way I needed them to be. Physically hard. Long miles, cold mornings, a lot of elevation. At night I was too tired to lie awake thinking about my wife. That's exactly what I needed, and I'm grateful I had the sense to do it. The 3rd night I found a site I liked on a bluff above the river. Good view, hard ground, no complaints. I made camp, ate, and got to sleep reasonably early. I woke up sometime in the early morning because something had changed. I lay very still in my sleeping bag, the way you do when you're not sure what woke you, trying to sort out what was different. The river below was doing the same thing it always did. The wind had come up a little, nothing alarming, but something had changed, and it took me a minute to figure out what it was. The smell. There was a smell in the air that wasn't there when I'd gone to sleep. Sour, faintly metallic, not quite blood, but in the family of it. I'd encountered that smell before in my survey work when we'd come across animal remains, something dead and a few days along. But this was fainter, more like a trace than a source. I lay there for probably 10 minutes, listening. Then it faded, or I stopped noticing it. I went back to sleep. In the morning I found the circle. It was about a foot across, which was larger than what some of the other accounts describe. I've heard others now, over the years, people who've had similar experiences, and the circles seem to vary. This one held 9 teeth. Human teeth, I was fairly certain. I'd seen enough in the course of my career in archaeological survey contexts to know what they looked like. I am a methodical person by nature. I photographed the circle with my phone before I touched anything. I noted the position relative to my tent, the approximate diameter, the spacing. I counted the teeth. I looked for footprints in the surrounding area. The ground up on that bluff was mostly rock and compacted dirt. No clear prints, no sign of disturbance. I sat down on a rock with my coffee, and I thought about it for a long time. I had no explanation. I had plenty of candidates. Someone was following me. Someone was watching me and leaving them as some kind of message or threat. Some animal had deposited them somehow, though I couldn't picture any animal doing that. But none of them survived examination. The arrangement was too deliberate for an animal. The teeth were clean, not scattered from some disturbed burial or archaeological site. They'd been placed. And the thing that settled over me while I sat there with my coffee was this. My wife had very bad dental problems in the last year of her life, from the medications. She'd lost several teeth in the months before she died. I know that doesn't mean anything. I want to be clear that I am not a superstitious man, and I do not believe in that kind of thing. But I sat on that rock in the Ozarks for a long time while the river ran below me, and I couldn't make myself dismantle the circle. I packed up around it. I stacked my gear to the side, broke down the tent, loaded my pack, all with that circle in the dirt beside me. And when I finally picked up my pack and started walking, I stopped once and looked back at it. I don't know what I expected to feel. I walked out that day, 5 miles to the trailhead, another mile to my car. The whole way I thought about the smell that had woken me in the night, and the circle, and the fact that I had been up on that bluff for a whole night before whatever left those teeth decided to leave them. The same thought Marcus had, later, that it was already there, the first night, before it left anything. I think about that a lot. I've been back twice since, to different sections of the forest. I don't go to that bluff. I'm not sure I could find it again exactly, and I'm not sure I want to. The last thing I'll say about it, I don't think whatever left those teeth meant me harm. I have no reason to think that. Nothing happened to me. I walked out fine. But there is a difference between something not meaning you harm and something being harmless. And I have never, in the 2 years since, fully settled on which one this was. Story 4, Ryan. I need to go back to something before I start, because if I don't say it up front, it'll seem like I'm leaving it out on purpose. I went into that forest to disappear for a while, not in the permanent sense. I want to be clear about that. I just needed a week where nobody could find me. I'd lost my job in March, my girlfriend had left in April, and by June I was sitting in a studio apartment in Fayetteville watching the same 4 walls close in, and I needed to go somewhere that didn't know my name. So I packed a bag and I drove to the forest, and I started walking north with no particular destination and no particular timeline, which I know now was not the smartest way to do it. I was 29. I'd done some camping in college, but nothing serious. My gear was adequate, not great. I had food for about 6 days, a map I'd printed off the internet, a compass I knew how to read in the basic sense, and a phone with about 40% battery that I'd already decided I wasn't going to use unless I had to. For the first 3 days, I was fine. Better than fine. That's the thing about the Ozarks in June. The forest is full and green and loud with things living in it, and after a few hours of walking, you stop thinking about rent, and you stop thinking about your ex, and you stop thinking about the guy who got the promotion you were supposed to get. You just walk. Your body does its thing, and your head eventually follows. I picked my campsites loosely, wherever there was flat ground and a water source. The third night, I camped in a hollow between 2 long ridges, close to a spring. A little exposed, not ideal, but I was tired, and it was getting dark. I made my fire smaller than usual that night. I remember that. I'm not sure why. Something about the hollow felt like it didn't want a lot of light in it. I know that sounds like I'm adding color after the fact, but I wrote it in my journal that night. I actually wrote the words, keeping the fire small tonight, something about this place. So that's documented. I slept fine, as far as I could tell. No strange dreams, no sounds that woke me. In the morning, there were 7 teeth in the dirt just beyond my sleeping bag. I hadn't set up a tent. I'd been cowboy camping. Just sleeping bag on a foam pad under the open sky. So whatever left those teeth was close, within a foot of me. I could have reached out in my sleep and touched it. That thought came later. In the moment, I just sat up and looked at them, and my first reaction was more confusion than fear. 7 teeth in a rough circle, about the size of a dinner plate, in the dirt right next to where I'd been lying with my head. I thought about animals. I ran through the list. Bears, raccoons, coyotes. Nothing made sense. An animal doesn't arrange things in circles. Then I thought about people. See, that's where it got bad for me. I'm not someone who's afraid of the dark, or afraid of the woods, or afraid of strange things. But I am afraid of people, of specific things people can do. And the thought that someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night and crouched down next to my head while I was sleeping and arranged teeth in a circle around me. That hit me somewhere very specific. I sat there with my knees pulled up to my chest for a while. I looked at the tree line. Normal morning. Birds. Light coming in diagonal across the hollow. Nothing moving that shouldn't be moving, but I kept looking at the spaces between the trees, because that's where you'd stand if you were watching a campsite and didn't want to be seen. I stayed in the hollow that whole day. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because leaving felt like admitting something, and I wasn't ready to admit it yet. Maybe because I'd come here to not run from things. I hiked out along the ridge for a few hours, came back in the afternoon, ate my dinner, and sat by a fire I kept much bigger this time. I didn't sleep well that second night. In the morning, there were 13 teeth. Same circle shape, bigger diameter, and they were in a different spot. This time around, the cold remains of my fire, not my sleeping area, like whatever left them, had noticed where I'd actually spent most of my night. I rolled up my gear in about 10 minutes flat. I didn't scatter the circle, I didn't photograph it, I just left it there, and started walking south toward the road. I walked for about 5 hours without stopping and got back to my car and drove to Fayetteville and sat in a diner and ordered coffee and eggs and ate the whole thing in about 4 minutes. The waitress asked if I was okay. I said yes. The thing I keep coming back to is the relocation. First night, teeth by my head. Second night, teeth by the fire. It had tracked where I was. It had watched me long enough on that second night to know I'd moved, and it adjusted. That's not an animal doing something by accident. That's something paying attention to me specifically. I've thought about that a lot in the 2 years since. The word that comes to mind is interest. Whatever it was interested in me. It had noticed me. It knew where I was sleeping. I got a new job in August. I'm doing better. I still have the journal entry about the small fire, about that feeling, I've read it probably 100 times. The last line I wrote before I went to sleep that third night, the night before I found the 13 teeth. Something out here knows I'm alone. I wrote that before I found them. I wrote that not knowing why. Story 5. Carol. Somebody else I know had an experience like this, and when they told me, I almost couldn't breathe, because I thought I was the only one. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I was 46 when it happened to me. I'm a high school science teacher. I've been teaching for 20 years, and I am not the kind of person who has experiences. You know what I mean? I'm practical. I believe in what I can measure. My husband and I used to hike together every fall before he got his knee replaced. After the surgery, we took 2 years off from the Ozarks, specifically because the terrain was too demanding for recovery. When he got the green light to go back, in October of the year before last, I was so relieved I planned the whole trip myself while he was still at work. We went in at a trailhead near Boxley Valley. 5 days, comfortable pace, staying at established campsites where possible. It was a second honeymoon kind of thing. We'd been having a tough year. Not with each other, just with everything around us. And this was supposed to be the reset. The first 2 nights were everything I needed them to be. We cooked real food on the camp stove and had a flask of bourbon and talked until the fire went low the way you don't talk at home, because home has its lists and its obligations. It was good. Really, genuinely good. The third night we set up camp near a creek I remembered from a previous trip. Beautiful spot. The creek curved around a little gravel bar, and the sycamores came down to the water, and in the evening light, it was honestly perfect. We ate dinner, and I remember thinking, this is the kind of night that pays for all the bad ones. We went to bed a little later than usual. My husband was asleep quickly. I lay awake for a while listening to the creek, which I normally find soothing, but that night I kept waking up for no reason. Not alarmed, just surfacing, like my sleep was shallow in a way it normally isn't. In the morning, my husband went to the creek to wash his face, and he called back to me in this tone. Not scared, just strange. He said, "Carol, come look at this." There were 2 circles, side by side in the dirt just outside our tent. One with 7 teeth, one with 9, roughly the same size, parallel to each other, about 8 inches apart. 2 circles. We stood there looking at them for I don't know how long. My husband is an engineer. He starts solving problems immediately. That's how his brain works. He crouched down and looked closely without touching them and started going through options. Somebody's prank. Somebody who's been carrying old teeth in the woods as a joke. Some kind of folk practice or ritual thing he'd heard about once. He wasn't sure where. I stood behind him, listening to him work through it, and I couldn't say anything. Because here's what I was thinking. I was thinking about the 2 circles. Not 1, 2. Whatever left them knew there were 2 of us. I didn't say that out loud because I didn't want to hear myself say it. My husband kept working through his list of explanations, and I stood behind him and thought about how something had come to our tent in the night, close enough to crouch by the door, and had counted us. Had known we were 2 people and had left 2 circles for us. I let my husband talk himself around to a calm explanation. A hiker's weird joke, most likely. We photographed them, kicked them apart, and hiked on after breakfast. He seemed fine by midday. He's good at settling things. I was not fine. I kept looking back on the trail. I don't know what I was looking for. I kept thinking about the 2 circles and what they meant, if they meant anything, and whether it mattered that one had 7 teeth and one had 9, and whether the different numbers were significant or just random, and I went around and around in that loop for most of the day. That night, different campsite, I didn't sleep much at all. I lay there next to my husband, who was breathing slow and deep, and I stared at the tent ceiling in the dark, and I thought, it knows there are 2 of us, and whatever it is, it wanted us to know that it knows. We didn't find anything the next morning, We finished the trip. It was fine. We've been back once since, different trailhead, and nothing happened. My husband still talks about it occasionally as the weird thing that one time he's genuinely not bothered by it. He's got a good explanation that works for him, and he's kept it. I can't get the two circles out of my head. I've tried, but every time I think about that campsite, I come back to the same image. Two circles, side by side, one for each of us. Something counted us. The next story is quieter than this one. That doesn't make it easier. Story 6. Patrick. My grandfather used to say that the Ozarks were old in a way the rest of the country wasn't. He grew up in Newton County, spent his whole life within about 40 miles of where he was born, and he said the hills there had a memory. He didn't mean that supernaturally. He was a practical man, a farmer. He meant that the land held things. History, weather patterns, the bones of old things, in a way that newer places didn't. He said you had to be respectful of old places, not because they would punish you if you weren't, but because you owed it to them. I thought about him a lot on that trip. I'm 38 now, was 36 then. I'm a veterinarian in Bentonville. My grandfather had passed the previous winter, and I went out to the forest partly to clear my head, and partly, I think, because it was something he would have understood. He'd spent time in those hills his whole life. He would have recognized what I was doing and why. I went in through a backcountry access point I'd heard about from a patient whose husband did a lot of hiking off the beaten path enough that I didn't expect to see other hikers. I planned 4 nights, solo, standard gear, nothing fancy. The first 2 nights were quiet. Good quiet. The kind my grandfather would have called right. On the 3rd day, I found myself in an area I didn't recall being mapped in quite the way it was presenting. A broad, flat area of old hardwood, very dense, the canopy thick enough that the light filtered down greenish and dim even at noon. It had a still quality that I noticed and didn't dislike. I set up camp there in the late afternoon. I did notice one thing before I went to sleep. I'd been checking the area around my tent the way I'd gotten in the habit of doing, just scanning the ground, and I noticed several small depressions in the soft soil nearby. Not footprints exactly, more like circular depressions. I looked at them for a moment and couldn't determine what made them, and then forgot about them. I slept deeply, which was unusual for me on solo trips. I normally sleep lightly outdoors, alert to sounds. That night I went out and didn't surface until almost 7, which was 2 hours later than I normally woke. That's the thing that bothered me most, in retrospect. Not the teeth. The teeth were there in the morning. 9 of them in a careful circle about a foot across, just to the east of my tent. I identified them as human immediately. Molars and 1 premolar. Worn, which meant adult. Not recent from the look of them, but I couldn't date them with any confidence. I sat with my coffee and looked at them with the same attention I'd give to something I was trying to diagnose. And I thought about those circular depressions I'd noticed in the soil the night before, and I thought about the unusual depth of my sleep, and I thought about my grandfather saying the hills held things. Then I thought about how a good vet can walk into a barn and know before examining any animal that something is wrong with one of them. Just a quality of the air, a stillness in an animal that should be moving, a change in the smell of a place. I'd been doing it for 12 years, and I was good at it, and I trusted it. Something was watching me in those hills. That was the diagnosis. I had no pathology to support it, no confirmed observation. Just the accumulated sensory data of 2 nights in that place and the particular quality of that morning. The air heavier than it should have been, the canopy filtering the light in that greenish way, the teeth in the circle and those depressions I'd noticed and ignored. I packed deliberately. I didn't rush. Something in me felt strongly that rushing would be the wrong approach, that moving in a controlled and unhurried way was important, though I couldn't articulate why I felt that. I spent about 20 minutes breaking camp, checking everything twice, the way my grandfather used to do things, fully without shortcuts. Before I left the site, I stood still for a moment, facing the tree line, not saying anything, not doing anything, just standing. I don't know what I was communicating, or if I was communicating anything at all. It just felt like the thing to do. I walked out over the next day and a half. Nothing happened. The forest felt normal from that point forward. I've been back to the Ozarks since, different areas. I've told a few people about it. My father, one of my colleagues, the woman who'd told me about that trailhead. They all had the same response, which was to be politely uncertain about what to make of it. My grandfather died before I could tell him. I've thought about what he would have said. I think he would have nodded. I think he would have said something about the hills holding things. I think he would have been less surprised than anyone else I've told. I miss him. That's most of what I have to say about this, if I'm honest. I just keep thinking about the depth of that sleep, how completely I went under, how unusual it was for me specifically. And I think about how long something could have stood outside my tent, in the dark, doing whatever it was doing with those teeth, while I didn't stir once. I've never slept that deeply outdoors before or since. Story 7, unnamed, from a letter. This one came to me as a handwritten letter, which I've now received a few times from people who don't want to send things electronically. This person gave me no name and asked me not to try to identify them. I've honored that. The handwriting was careful and even, which made the content harder to read in some ways. I'm not going to tell you what I do or where I live because I don't want to be findable on this. I know that sounds paranoid. I'm not a paranoid person normally, but I'm not a paranoid person who'd ever found teeth in the woods before either, and now I am, so I'm adjusting. It happened twice. That's the part I haven't been able to tell anyone, because once is a weird story and twice sounds like a problem. The first time I thought it was a coincidence or a fluke or something I couldn't explain. The second time I understood it was about me specifically. I don't know why I understood that. I just did. The first trip was in the Ozarks, spring. I won't be more specific than that. I went alone. I went for 6 days. I was experienced and prepared. On the fourth morning, I found 6 teeth in a circle outside my tent. I was disturbed and confused, and I left that day, which I think was the right call. The second trip was 8 months later. Different part of the forest, different trailhead, a section I'd never been to, nowhere near the first location. I want to be clear about that distance because I thought of it as protection, starting fresh, a different piece of forest that couldn't be connected to the first. On the third morning, 8 teeth, circle, same spacing, same placement relative to the tent door. I sat in my tent for a long time that morning. I didn't look at the circle for a while, just sat with my knees pulled up and let my breathing settle. The shape was the same diameter, roughly, the same careful spacing. Whatever left them the first time had been there again, or something identical to it had been there, which I think is actually the same thing. I thought about a few things sitting in that tent. I thought about how I'd chosen that second trailhead specifically because it was far from the first one, how I'd picked it off a map while sitting in my apartment, decided on it quietly, told no one where I was going. I thought about what it means if something followed me from the first forest to the second. Not the same forest, a different part, a new area, weeks and weeks later. And then I thought about the other possibility, which I like less. That it didn't follow me, that it was already there. That wherever I went in these hills, it had always been there. And it would always be there, and it had simply been waiting for me to show up so it could tell me so. I don't go into the backcountry anymore. I've been hiking on maintained day trails with other people around. I don't plan to change that. I think about it a lot. I still can't fully decide which is worse. Something that followed me or something that was just always already there. I'll never know. That's the part that actually keeps me up. Stories like this don't end when the narration stops. You carry them with you. Story 8. Derek. I'll tell this part first, because it changes everything else. My brother went missing in the Ozarks in 2019. Not a disappearance. He was found after 4 days. Dehydrated, disoriented, about 6 miles off his planned route. He was okay. He never fully explained how he got that far off course, and he stopped talking about the trip pretty shortly after he got home, which was not like him. He was not the kind of person who quit talking about things. I went back to that general area the following summer. I'll admit that. I was looking for something I couldn't name, some piece of it that would make sense of what he went through. His wife said I was being morbid. She was probably right. I'm a contractor, I'm 42, I've spent a lot of my life working outdoors, and I'm comfortable in the woods. I don't get rattled easily. You can't work a job site for 20 years and be the kind of person who spooks at every strange sound. I went in for 4 days in late June. I had roughly the same area my brother had been in marked on my GPS, or as close as I could get it from the trip report he'd filed before he went. I wasn't trying to retrace his route exactly. I just wanted to be in that general country. I don't know what I thought I was going to find. The first night I camped on a long ridge with a view west. Good camp. I ate well, slept fine, heard nothing unusual. In the morning, nothing on the ground around the tent. Second night, I pushed deeper into a denser section of timber, following a creek bed that wasn't marked on my map, but was easy enough to navigate. Set up camp on a flat above the creek. It was darker in there than I liked, not enough sky visible, but I was tired, and it was a good flat. Sometime in the night, I woke up and reached for my phone to check the time, and my hand hit something before it hit the phone. On the ground beside my sleeping bag, inside the tent. A tooth. One tooth, sitting on the tent floor about 6 inches from my hand. I turned on my flashlight. I picked it up. I turned it over. Human molar. Worn. Same as what others have described. I sat up and looked at my tent very carefully. Both zippers were still fully closed. I checked them twice. Fully closed the way I'd left them. My tent had no tiers that I knew of, no gaps. There was no way for something to get inside my tent without opening it. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked the outside of the tent thoroughly. In the dirt just outside the door, another 8 teeth in a circle. The same diameter I'd now heard described by others, though I didn't know that then. And then around the perimeter of my tent, spaced every few feet, single teeth, not in circles, just placed individually in a ring around the whole tent. The one inside, the 9 outside in the main circle, and then the ring of individual ones around the tent itself. Whatever left them had worked from the outside in, or from the inside out. I couldn't stop thinking about the one inside, how it got there, whether I had unknowingly brought it in on my boot, whether a corner of the tent had been lifted and it had been slid under, whether there was an explanation at all. I packed up quickly and I walked out, and I've never been back. I called my brother when I got home. I told him what I'd found. There was a long pause, and then he said, very quietly, he said, "Did you go where I told you not to go?" And I said I hadn't known he'd told me not to go there. He said he'd told me. He was certain he'd told me. He'd told everyone, he said. He'd been very clear. I went back through every conversation we'd had about that trip. He had never said that to me. He had never, not once, told me not to go to that area. He got very quiet when I told him that. He said he had definitely told me. He was absolutely certain. I didn't push it. I let him be certain. But the thing about my brother's 4 missing days, the thing I've never been able to move past, he never told us what happened during them. Not the real version. He gave us the survival version. Got turned around, pushed too hard to find the trail, got exhausted and confused. All plausible. All probably partially true. But he came home different, quieter. He stopped doing solo trips entirely and he never went back to the Ozarks. And every time the subject came up, he got a specific look. Not scared exactly, just finished. Like a door had been shut, and he was done with whatever was on the other side of it. I've never asked him directly if he found teeth. I've never been able to make myself ask. Story 9, Teri. The hard part is that I'm a geologist. I study rock formations for a living. I'm out in the field regularly. I approach everything empirically. I hate that this is my story. I've been very resistant to telling it because it makes me sound like someone I'm not. But here's the thing about data. Data doesn't care what you believe. Data just is. And the data from that trip in the Ozarks doesn't fit any model I've been able to put it into. I was doing legitimate field work, not recreational camping. I was mapping an outcrop area in the eastern part of the forest. Solo work that I'd done a dozen times in similar terrain. I had my sampling gear, my GPS unit, my field notebook, all of it. I set up a base camp near the outcrop I was working and planned to spend 3 nights before driving back to the university. The outcrop was interesting. I won't bore you with specifics, but there was a feature I was documenting that required close-up work and repeated visits, so I was in the same small area for most of each day. I came back to camp each evening around sunset. Second morning, circle in the dirt, 7 teeth. I photographed, I measured, I recorded everything in my field notebook with the same rigor I applied to the outcrop. Diameter, 11.4 inches. Number of specimens, 7. Spacing between specimens, approximately 1.6 inches, remarkably consistent. Material, human dental specimens, apparent age unknown, where pattern consistent with adult dentition. I noted it. I moved on with my day. Third morning, 11 teeth. Diameter, 14.2 inches. Spacing, 1.8 inches. Again, remarkably consistent. What I noted in my field notebook that morning, and I still have the notebook. Spacing uniformity suggests tool use or careful manual placement. Ruling out animal agency. Concluding, human origin, deliberate arrangement, unknown purpose. Unknown purpose. I sat with that phrase for a long time. In science, unknown purpose is not an ending. It's an opening. It means you haven't found the right framework yet. It means you keep looking. Here's the framework problem. I had been the only human in that area for 3 days, by every measure I could apply. No other tire tracks at the access road. No sounds of other campers. No visual contact with another person. The terrain was not casual hiking territory. Someone would have had to deliberately come into that specific area at night, silently enough not to disturb me, for 2 consecutive nights. To leave teeth. In circles. I've tried to fit that into a rational model for 2 years. The closest I've gotten is, it was a person, it was deliberate, and they didn't want to be seen. That's the only column in which all the data fits. But then, there's the measurement consistency, 1.6 inches on night 1, 1.8 on night 2. That's the kind of precision that suggests practice, repetition. Someone who has done this many times and has gotten very good at it. That's the thing. I can't move out of my head, the precision. Whatever it is, it has done this enough times to be practiced at it. I finished my field work. I documented the circles and moved on. I wrote a brief note in my report under anomalous observations, which I then removed from the final version before submitting to the department because I didn't know how to defend it in an academic context. But I kept the field notebook. I look at those measurements sometimes. 1.6 inches, 1.8 inches, the diameter expanding each night by almost exactly 3 inches. Scaling up. I noticed that on the drive home, and I wish I hadn't. Story 10. James. I'll keep this short because I've told it enough times now that I've learned what matters and what doesn't. I was hiking the Buffalo River Trail alone. Labor Day weekend, 4 days planned. I'm 27. I work in IT, and I go camping about 4 times a year. This was not my first time in the Ozarks, and it wasn't my first time going alone. Day 2, morning, 12 teeth in a circle. That's the main fact. But here's the specific part. When I found them, I immediately thought of my grandmother. She passed 6 years ago, and she had a lot of dental work in her later years. A partial plate she wore, which she kept in a glass of water on the bathroom sink overnight. I don't know why I thought of her. I hadn't thought about that detail in years, maybe not since the funeral. I stood looking at those teeth on a trail in the Ozarks, and I thought about my grandmother's partial plate in a glass of water on a bathroom sink, and I felt something I can't fully describe. Not grief exactly, not fear exactly. Something in between that had the quality of a message I didn't have the vocabulary to read. I sat down on a rock near the circle for a while, just sat there. Nobody hikes the Ozarks in September and thinks about their dead grandmother's partial plate. There's no reason for that to come up. There's no thread connecting those two things. But it came up, and it was vivid, and it sat on me for the rest of the day. I finished my trip. Nothing else happened. I've been trying to figure out for 2 years whether my brain made that connection independently, pulled up that specific memory, because the teeth triggered some kind of association I wasn't conscious of. That would be the simple explanation. The brain connects related images. That's what brains do. But I keep coming back to the feeling. That feeling of a message I didn't have the vocabulary for. I've never had that feeling before or since. Story 11. A woman who signed her name only as M. I've been sitting with this for almost 3 years, and I still don't have a clean way to say it, so I'm just going to say it. I'm a nurse. Night shifts, county hospital. I've seen a lot of things that would rattle most people, and I've gotten reasonably good at not being rattled. I went into the Ozarks in November of 3 years ago for a solo 5-day trip, which I do at least twice a year to decompress. I know that terrain. I've been going there since I was in my 20s. The teeth started on night 1. That's different from most accounts I've heard. For me, there was no settling in period, no first normal night. Night 1, I set up camp, went to sleep, woke up, 5 teeth in a circle. I'm a nurse. I've seen teeth outside of mouths in clinical contexts. I identified them immediately, and the identification was clean and certain, and there was no way to rationalize them as something else. I stayed. I'm not saying that was smart. I'm saying that's what I did. Night 2, 9 teeth. Night 3, 14 teeth, and the circle was tight enough around the tent that I had to step over it to get out in the morning. Night 4, I stayed awake. I lay in my sleeping bag in full gear, headlamp off, and I lay still and quiet, and I waited. I'm used to long nights. I've done 12-hour overnight shifts for 8 years. I know how to be still and patient and awake. I stayed awake until about 2 in the morning. Then I heard something. I want to be careful about how I describe it because I know how this sounds. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't an animal sound. It was a very soft, very deliberate sound, close to the tent, that had a quality I can only describe as careful, like the sound of something trying not to make a sound. It happened once, then silence. Then, maybe 15 minutes later, once more, just outside the tent wall, very close. I didn't open the tent. I'm a nurse. I have good clinical instincts, and every single one of them said, "Do not open the tent." I lay there. I waited. I didn't sleep. In the morning, 22 teeth, the largest circle yet, close enough around the tent that when I stepped outside, I was standing inside it. I packed up that morning and I walked out, and I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I think about the decision not to open the tent. I've thought about it hundreds of times. I believe it was the right decision. I don't know what I would have seen if I'd opened it. I don't know what was out there. What I keep coming back to, what I can't shake, is this. The sound was careful. Whatever made it was trying to be quiet. and that implies awareness. It knew I might hear it. It knew what hearing means. Whatever was outside my tent on that fourth night knew I was awake and listening. And it still came. Story 12. No name given. Text message forwarded by a third party. This came to me secondhand from a woman in Eureka Springs who said a friend had sent it to her after the friend came home from a trip, and the friend had since deleted the conversation and wouldn't discuss it further. She forwarded me the texts with the friend's knowledge, or at least the friend's silence, which the woman interpreted as consent. Hey, so something weird happened. I was out at the campsite we used last fall, alone this time, and I woke up this morning to these little circles of teeth around my tent. Human teeth, I think, like actual teeth, not rocks. I know how that sounds. I took pictures, but I don't really want to look at them. I'm fine, I just feel weird, like something was close while I was sleeping and I didn't hear it. I keep thinking about how quiet it must have been. Like, it was standing right there, and it was completely quiet, and I didn't know. Anyway, I'm coming home today. Don't tell anyone I told you this. That was the whole exchange. 3 texts. The woman who sent it to me said her friend was fine. Home, back at work, not talking about it. She said the friend was someone who always locked the car twice in a parking lot and checked the stove burners before leaving the house and slept with the door locked and the closet light on. After the camping trip, she stopped doing those things. The woman who forwarded me the texts asked me why I thought that was. Why someone careful would become less careful after something like that. I didn't have a good answer. I've thought about it since. The only thing I can come up with. Some kinds of caution only make sense if there's something you can actually lock out. If you come to believe there isn't, the locks stop feeling like protection. They just feel like theater. Story 13. A man who called himself Owen. I want to end with this one because it's the most recent account I have, and because Owen told it to me in a way that I still think about. He called rather than writing, which is unusual, and he talked quietly, like he was checking over his shoulder, even though he was at home. Owen is 63. He's been hiking in the Ozarks for 40 years. He's done more solo backcountry trips in those hills than he could count. He said he knew that forest the way he knew his own house. The layout of it, the feel of different sections, the way the light fell in certain places in different seasons. He went in last October for what he said was supposed to be a simple 4-day trip, a route he'd done a dozen times, country he knew well. On the second night, he found the circle. He wasn't surprised, he told me. That was the first thing he said about it. He wasn't surprised. He said he'd heard about this from someone else, years before. A man who'd hiked with him once and told him about finding teeth in the woods. And Owen said he'd believed the man and filed it away as something the forest did occasionally, something that happened there. He said, I'd been wondering when it would be my turn. He stayed all 4 nights. He found circles on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th mornings, 7, 12, and 9 teeth, respectively. He photographed each one. He measured each one. He didn't scatter them. He noted the time of morning he found them, and the temperature and wind direction, and the general feel of the night before. On the 3rd night, he did what M had done. He stayed awake and waited. And he heard it too. He described it almost identically to how she had. A careful sound. A sound trying not to be a sound. Close to the tent, maybe 6 feet from where he lay. But Owen did something different. Owen spoke to it. He said he lay in his sleeping bag, and he said, out loud, quietly, in as steady a voice as he could manage, I know you're there. I'm not going to bother you. He said the sound stopped immediately. Then, after a long pause, he said he heard something that he could not interpret. A single sound. Not quite a sound, actually. More like the absence of a sound that had been there a moment before. Like something being withdrawn. Like presence becoming absence. The next morning, there were no teeth. He walked out on schedule. He drove home. He called me that evening. 2:24 p.m. Story 4. Ryan. I need to go back to something before I start, because if I don't say it up front, it'll seem like I'm leaving it out on purpose. I went into that forest to disappear for a while, not in the permanent sense. I want to be clear about that. I just needed a week where nobody could find me. I'd lost my job in March, my girlfriend had left in April, and by June I was sitting in a studio apartment in Fayetteville watching the same 4 walls close in, and I needed to go somewhere that didn't know my name. So I packed a bag and I drove to the forest, and I started walking north with no particular destination and no particular timeline, which I know now was not the smartest way to do it. I was 29. I'd done some camping in college, but nothing serious. My gear was adequate, not great. I had food for about 6 days, a map I'd printed off the internet, a compass I knew how to read in the basic sense, and a phone with about 40% battery that I'd already decided I wasn't going to use unless I had to. For the first 3 days, I was fine. Better than fine. That's the thing about the Ozarks in June. The forest is full and green and loud with things living in it, and after a few hours of walking, you stop thinking about rent, and you stop thinking about your ex, and you stop thinking about the guy who got the promotion you were supposed to get. You just walk. Your body does its thing, and your head eventually follows. I picked my campsites loosely, wherever there was flat ground and a water source. The third night, I camped in a hollow between 2 long ridges, close to a spring. A little exposed, not ideal, but I was tired, and it was getting dark. I made my fire smaller than usual that night. I remember that. I'm not sure why. Something about the hollow felt like it didn't want a lot of light in it. I know that sounds like I'm adding color after the fact, but I wrote it in my journal that night. I actually wrote the words, keeping the fire small tonight, something about this place. So that's documented. I slept fine, as far as I could tell. No strange dreams, no sounds that woke me. In the morning, there were 7 teeth in the dirt just beyond my sleeping bag. I hadn't set up a tent. I'd been cowboy camping. Just sleeping bag on a foam pad under the open sky. So whatever left those teeth was close, within a foot of me. I could have reached out in my sleep and touched it. That thought came later. In the moment, I just sat up and looked at them, and my first reaction was more confusion than fear. 7 teeth in a rough circle, about the size of a dinner plate, in the dirt right next to where I'd been lying with my head. I thought about animals. I ran through the list. Bears, raccoons, coyotes. Nothing made sense. An animal doesn't arrange things in circles. Then I thought about people. See, that's where it got bad for me. I'm not someone who's afraid of the dark, or afraid of the woods, or afraid of strange things. But I am afraid of people, of specific things people can do. And the thought that someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night and crouched down next to my head while I was sleeping and arranged teeth in a circle around me. That hit me somewhere very specific. I sat there with my knees pulled up to my chest for a while. I looked at the tree line. Normal morning. Birds. Light coming in diagonal across the hollow. Nothing moving that shouldn't be moving. But I kept looking at the spaces between the trees, because that's where you'd stand if you were watching a campsite and didn't want to be seen. I stayed in the hollow that whole day. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because leaving felt like admitting something, and I wasn't ready to admit it yet. Maybe because I'd come here to not run from things. I hiked out along the ridge for a few hours, came back in the afternoon, ate my dinner, and sat by a fire I kept much bigger this time. I didn't sleep well that second night. In the morning, there were 13 teeth. Same circle shape, bigger diameter, and they were in a different spot. This time around, the cold remains of my fire, not my sleeping area, like whatever left them, had noticed where I'd actually spent most of my night. I rolled up my gear in about 10 minutes flat. I didn't scatter the circle, I didn't photograph it. I just left it there and started walking south toward the road. I walked for about 5 hours without stopping and got back to my car and drove to Fayetteville and sat in a diner and ordered coffee and eggs and ate the whole thing in about 4 minutes. The waitress asked if I was okay. I said yes. The thing I keep coming back to is the relocation. First night, teeth by my head. Second night, teeth by the fire. It had tracked where I was. It had watched me long enough on that second night to know I'd moved, and it adjusted. That's not an animal doing something by accident. That's something paying attention to me specifically. I've thought about that a lot in the 2 years since. The word that comes to mind is interest. Whatever it was interested in me. It had noticed me. It knew where I was sleeping. I got a new job in August. I'm doing better. I still have the journal entry about the small fire, about that feeling. I've read it probably 100 times. The last line I wrote before I went to sleep that third night, the night before I found the 13 teeth. Something out here knows I'm alone. I wrote that before I found them. I wrote that not knowing why. Story 5. Carol. Somebody else I know had an experience like this. And when they told me, I almost couldn't breathe, because I thought I was the only one. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I was 46 when it happened to me. I'm a high school science teacher. I've been teaching for 20 years, and I am not the kind of person who has experiences. You know what I mean? I'm practical. I believe in what I can measure. My husband and I used to hike together every fall before he got his knee replaced. After the surgery, we took 2 years off from the Ozarks, specifically because the terrain was too demanding for recovery. When he got the green light to go back, in October of the year before last, I was so relieved I planned the whole trip myself while he was still at work. We went in at a trailhead near Boxley Valley. 5 days, comfortable pace, staying at established campsites where possible. It was a second honeymoon kind of thing. We'd been having a tough year. Not with each other, just with everything around us. And this was supposed to be the reset. The first 2 nights were everything I needed them to be. We cooked real food on the camp stove and had a flask of bourbon and talked until the fire went low the way you don't talk at home, because home has its lists and its obligations. It was good. Really, genuinely good. The third night we set up camp near a creek I remembered from a previous trip. Beautiful spot. The creek curved around a little gravel bar, and the sycamores came down to the water, and in the evening light, it was honestly perfect. We ate dinner, and I remember thinking, this is the kind of night that pays for all the bad ones. We went to bed a little later than usual. My husband was asleep quickly. I lay awake for a while listening to the creek, which I normally find soothing, but that night I kept waking up for no reason. Not alarmed, just surfacing, like my sleep was shallow in a way it normally isn't. In the morning, my husband went to the creek to wash his face, and he called back to me in this tone. Not scared, just strange. He said, "Carol, come look at this." There were 2 circles, side by side in the dirt just outside our tent, one with 7 teeth, one with 9, roughly the same size, parallel to each other, about 8 inches apart. 2 circles. We stood there looking at them for I don't know how long. My husband is an engineer. He starts solving problems immediately. That's how his brain works. He crouched down and looked closely without touching them and started going through options. Somebody's prank. He said he'd been wanting to tell somebody who wouldn't think he was losing his mind. I asked him what he thought it was. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think it's been there a long time. I think it's been there long before there were hikers. I think the teeth are something it leaves to say that it knows you're there. And I think when I told it, I knew it was there too. That was enough. It had already said what it needed to say." I asked him if he was going back. He said yes. He said he'd been going into those hills for 40 years, and he wasn't going to stop now. I asked if he was afraid. He said, "I was afraid before I spoke to it. After, I was just tired." He paused. Then he said, "The forest is old, older than we know how to think about, I don't think it means any harm. I just think it wants to be known. I haven't spoken to Owen since that call. I've thought about what he said many times. I think it wants to be known. I don't know if that's comfort or not. I've been trying to decide. Most of the people in these accounts are home now, back in their lives, their houses, their routines. They go to work, they sleep in beds with doors that lock. Some of them have gone back to the forest, some have not. What they share is something specific and hard to name. Not exactly trauma, not exactly grief, more like the sensation of having been noticed by something that you cannot see, and understanding, in some quiet and permanent way, that you were never as alone as you thought you were. You're in a bed right now, or close enough to one, with headphones on. The room is dark, or nearly. There are walls around you, a ceiling overhead, a door somewhere that is probably closed. Just remember that the people in these stories also had a tent.